Right now, somewhere in the world, a cat is sleeping curled beside a human. Maybe it's on a bed in Tokyo, stretched across a laptop in London, wedged between pillows in Sao Paulo. This exact scene, this intimate moment of cross-species companionship, is happening in hundreds of millions of homes simultaneously. Cats and humans sleeping side by side like it's the most natural thing in the world. But here's what's strange. It shouldn't be natural at all. Think about every other animal we call domesticated. Dogs, we actively bred them from wolves over tens of thousands of years, selecting for loyalty, obedience, the desperate need to please us. Cows, sheep, pigs, we captured them, fenced them in, controlled their breeding for meat and milk and wool. Horses, we broke their wild spirits and bent them to our will. Even chickens, we've transformed them so completely that they barely resemble their jungle fowl ancestors. We chose all of them. We decided they would serve us, and we shaped them into what we needed. But cats chose us. Nobody domesticated cats. Not really. They just showed up one day, probably around 10,000 years ago, and decided that living near humans wasn't so bad after all. And here's the really weird part. They barely changed. A house cat's DNA is almost identical to a wild cat's. Their skeletons are nearly indistinguishable. Put a tabby next to an African wildcat and you'll struggle to spot the difference. After 10,000 years of living with humans, cats are still essentially wild animals who simply tolerate us. Yet somehow, they've conquered the entire world. There are over 600 million domestic cats on Earth today. They've spread to every continent except Antarctica. They've infiltrated our homes, dominated our internet, claimed our furniture as their territory. In many countries, there are nearly as many cats as there are humans. And unlike dogs who needed us to survive, cats could walk away tomorrow and do just fine. Most of them still hunt. Most of them still maintain that wild independence. They don't need us, but they stay anyway. So what happened? How did these small, solitary hunters go from prowling the ancient deserts of the Middle East to sleeping on your pillow? And more importantly, why did they bother? What made cats decide that these loud, clumsy apes were worth sticking around for? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make it. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time. It's fascinating to me that someone could be listening in Singapore at sunrise while someone else is in Seattle at bedtime, and we're all thinking about cats together. The story I'm about to tell you spans 10,000 years and crosses every civilization humans have built. It involves ancient Egyptian temples and medieval witch hunts, Viking longships and Chinese emperors, genetic mysteries and archaeological surprises. It's a story about how the world's most successful predator formed an alliance with the world's most dangerous primate, and how that partnership changed both species forever. But it's also a story filled with mysteries that scientists are only beginning to unravel, like why cats purr, a sound that serves no obvious evolutionary purpose, or how they navigate back to homes hundreds of miles away, or why they seem to sense things we can't, staring at empty corners, reacting to presences we'll never perceive. Here's what we do know. Cats weren't bred for tameness. They weren't trained for obedience. They weren't captured and controlled like other livestock. Instead, they emerged from the wild through a process so subtle, so gradual, that nobody even noticed it was happening until it was already done. They're ghosts that moved into our world so quietly that we forgot they were ever wild at all. And the evidence of their journey is everywhere. It's written in ancient hieroglyphs and medieval manuscripts. It's buried in archaeological sites from China to Peru. It's encoded in their DNA, carrying secrets about migrations and mutations that scientists are only now learning to read. Every cat alive today is a living time capsule, carrying genetic memories of that first moment when wild met human and decided to stay. Tonight, we're going to follow that journey from the beginning, from the fierce predators of the ancient wilderness to the creature currently sleeping on your couch. From the wild cats who first crept into human settlements seeking mice to the billions of cats who now rule the internet and our hearts. It's a journey nobody planned, nobody controlled, nobody even fully understands. But it's the secret history of how cats chose us. And it starts in the desert 10,000 years ago, when the world was changing and humans were about to invent civilization. Before there were cats sleeping on your keyboard, before there were cats knocking things off counters, before there were cats judging you from doorways, there was Felis sylvestris libica, the African wildcat, a small sandy-coloured predator that had absolutely no intention of ever becoming your pet. These weren't house cats, they weren't even close. They were apex predators in their weight class, perfectly evolved hunting machines that had been stalking rodents across North Africa and the Near East for hundreds of thousands of years. And they were completely, utterly uninterested in humans. Here's what makes this remarkable. Of all the small cat species in the world, and there are dozens, only one ever became domesticated. Not the European wildcat, which looks nearly identical, not the various Asian wildcats, not the jungle cats, sand cats or black-footed cats, just this one species, just Felis sylvestris libica. Why? The answer isn't what you'd expect. It wasn't because they were friendlier, it wasn't because they were smaller or cuter or more docile, it was because of where they lived and what they ate. Picture the landscape 10,000 years ago. The last ice age is ending. The climate is warming, and across a belt of territory stretching from North Africa through the Levant and into the Arabian Peninsula, grasslands and semi-arid zones are expanding. This is the world of the African wildcat. These environments were perfect for them, not dense forests where larger predators dominated, not open plains where they'd be exposed, but scrubland, rocky outcrops, areas with scattered vegetation and plenty of hiding spots. Places where small rodents thrived and where a solitary patient hunter could make a good living. The African wildcat weighed maybe 8 to 12 pounds, slightly larger than a modern house cat, with longer legs, a leaner build and a striped sandy coat that made them nearly invisible against desert rocks. Their tails were longer too, with distinct black bands and a black tip. Evolution had painted them to disappear. But their real advantage was behavioural. Unlike most cat species, which are either highly territorial loners or occasionally social, African wildcats occupied a middle ground. They were solitary hunters, yes, each cat maintained its own territory, but their territories overlapped slightly, especially around rich food sources. And crucially, they were willing to tolerate the presence of other cats at a distance. This flexibility would prove essential, because a wildcat that automatically fled from any other living creature would never stick around humans long enough for domestication to begin. And a wildcat that was aggressively territorial would attack anything that entered its space, making coexistence impossible. African wildcats were neither. They were cautious but not paranoid, independent but not hostile. They had, through pure evolutionary accident, exactly the temperament that would allow them to eventually, slowly, over thousands of years, drift into a completely new relationship with a species they'd never encountered before. Compare them to their closest relatives. The European wildcat Felis sylvestris sylvestris looks almost identical. Same size, similar colouring, nearly the same DNA. But European wildcats are intensely antisocial and aggressively territorial. They attack domestic cats on sight. Attempts to tame them, even when raised from kittens, almost always fail. They remain wild, suspicious, and completely unsuited to human contact. The Asian wildcats show similar patterns. Beautiful animals, successful predators, but lacking that crucial behavioral flexibility that would allow them to tolerate proximity to other species. Even more telling are the other small cats that shared territory with early humans. The sand cat, perfectly adapted to desert life, might seem like an ideal candidate for domestication. Small rodent specialist occupies similar ecological niches, but sand cats are extreme specialists, requiring very specific conditions and showing almost no behavioral plasticity. They never came close to domestication. The jungle cat, another Near Eastern species, actually did interact with ancient human settlements occasionally. There's evidence that ancient Egyptians tried to tame them, but jungle cats proved too aggressive, too unpredictable. They would tolerate humans for a while, then suddenly turn hostile without warning. They lacked the stable temperament necessary for true domestication. So we're left with Felis silvestris libica, not because they were special, not because ancient humans chose them from among many candidates, but because they happened to have the right combination of traits in the right place at the right time. Now, let's talk about that place, the Fertile Crescent, though it wouldn't be called that for another 10,000 years. A region of relatively reliable rainfall and diverse plant life, stretching from the Nile Valley through the Levant and down into Mesopotamia. This is where agriculture would be invented. This is where civilization would emerge. And this is where wildcats were already living. These wildcats had established territories in exactly the zones that would become most important to early humans. Rocky hillsides where wild grasses grew, river valleys with scattered trees and abundant prey, transitional zones between different habitats where biodiversity was highest. They were hunters of the in-between places, too large to chase insects efficiently, but too small to take down rabbits reliably. Their sweet spot was rodents, mice, rats, voles, the small mammals that thrived on seeds and grain, the exact species that would become humanity's greatest agricultural pest. But the wildcats didn't know that yet. 10,000 years before agriculture, they were just doing what their species had always done, hunting at dawn and dusk, spending hot midday hours resting in shaded rock crevices, marking territory, occasionally encountering other wildcats and engaging in the complex negotiations of feline social life. A typical wildcat territory might cover a square mile or two, depending on prey density. Within that range, they'd have regular hunting routes, preferred resting spots, and fallback positions for when larger predators were nearby. They knew every rock, every bush, every mouse burrow. They were, by any measure, perfectly adapted to their environment, successful, independent, complete unto themselves. They had no need for humans, no desire for human contact, no evolutionary pressure pushing them toward domestication. And yet, within a few thousand years, everything would change. Not because the wildcats changed first, but because their environment was about to transform in ways no evolutionary pressure could have prepared them for. Humans were about to invent agriculture, and whether the wildcats knew it or not, whether they wanted it or not, that invention would pull them into an entirely new evolutionary trajectory. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in this moment before civilization, wildcats are simply wildcats, predators in the half-light, shadows with teeth, masters of their domain. Before we continue with how this all changed, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this from? And what time is it there? Are you drifting off to sleep with cats on the mind? Or starting your day with the history of humanity's strangest friendship? Drop a comment and let me know. Because here's the thing, every cat owner today, in every time zone, in every country, is participating in a relationship that began in one specific place, with one specific species. The cat sleeping on your couch right now carries DNA that can be traced back to those sandy-coloured hunters in the ancient Near East. Every single one. That's not true of dogs, which were domesticated multiple times from different wolf populations. It's not true of most domestic animals, which show complex mixed ancestry from various wild populations. But cats are different. Genetic analysis is absolutely clear. All domestic cats, from Maine Coons to Siamese, from street cats to show cats, descend from Felis sylvestris libica. The African wildcat remains the only wild cat species to ever fully integrate into human society, which makes what happened next even more remarkable. Because this integration wasn't conquest, it wasn't submission, it wasn't even cooperation, not at first. It was something stranger, something that had never happened before in the history of life on Earth. It was domestication without intention, transformation without design, a relationship that neither species planned but both species shaped. And it all began when humans made one crucial decision, a decision that would change the wildcats' world forever, pulling them from their rocky territories into the strange new landscape of human civilization. They decided to store grain. Picture this. 12,000 years ago, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and down into Egypt. Your ancestors have just figured out something that will change the course of history forever. They've discovered agriculture. This wasn't some sudden eureka moment. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to invent farming. Instead, it was a gradual shift that probably took thousands of years. Small groups started noticing that wild grains grew back in the same places year after year. They began returning to these spots seasonally, harvesting the seeds. Eventually, some clever individuals realized they could plant seeds themselves, control the harvest, store the surplus, and everything changed. For the first time in human history, people didn't have to follow their food. They could stay in one place. They built permanent structures, not just temporary shelters. Villages formed, then towns. Within a few thousand years, the first cities were rising from the dusty plains. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems, but one in particular that nobody had anticipated. Grain storage. See, when you're a hunter-gatherer, you eat what you find and keep moving. There's no surplus, no stockpile sitting around attracting attention. But farmers needed to store their harvest to last through the winter, to save seed for next year's planting, to feed a growing population that wasn't out hunting and gathering anymore. So they built granaries, storage buildings and underground chambers, large ceramic vessels packed with wheat, barley, emmer, and einkorn. Tons and tons of grain, all concentrated in one place. And the mice noticed. Suddenly, if you were a house mouse or a rat in the Fertile Crescent, you had hit the evolutionary jackpot. Why scavenge for scattered seeds across miles of territory when humans had thoughtfully gathered millions of seeds into convenient, accessible piles? Within generations, rodent populations around human settlements exploded. Archaeological sites from this period show massive increases in rodent bones in the fossil record. These weren't wild mice passing through. These were resident populations living in and around human structures, breeding prolifically on unlimited food. The early farmers tried everything. They built better storage containers, they elevated their granaries, they set traps. They probably trained dogs to hunt rodents, though dogs are frankly terrible at catching mice. Too big, too slow, too easily distracted. What they needed was a specialist. A predator specifically evolved for hunting small, fast-moving prey. A hunter with lightning reflexes, extraordinary patience, excellent night vision, and acute hearing sensitive enough to detect a mouse moving under a floorboard. They needed cats. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, because cats didn't need humans. Not really. The ancestors of your house cat, Felis sylvestris libici, the African wildcat, were doing just fine before agriculture came along. They were solitary hunters living across North Africa and the Middle East, perfectly adapted to their environment. Medium-sized carnivores occupying the ecological niche between the tiny hunters like weasels and the large predators like leopards. But then humans created something unprecedented in natural history. They created an artificial concentration of prey so dense that it could support multiple predators in a small area. Those granaries weren't just feeding rodents. They were creating a buffet that could sustain a much higher density of cats than the natural landscape ever could. Some wildcats must have noticed. Maybe they were hunting nearby and detected the ultrasonic squeaking of mice. Maybe they followed the scent trails. However it happened, certain individual cats began spending time near human settlements. Not in them at first, just around the edges, hunting in the twilight hours when both humans and rodents were most active. And the humans noticed something remarkable. The settlements where cats hunted had fewer mice. Their grain stores lasted longer. Disease rates probably dropped too, since rodents carry plague, hantavirus, and a dozen other pathogens that would have devastated early agricultural communities. So the humans let the cats stay. Maybe they even encouraged them, leaving out scraps of food, creating safe spaces where cats could den and raise kittens. But they weren't actively domesticating them, not the way they had with dogs thousands of years earlier, or with sheep, goats, and cattle around this same period. This is crucial to understanding cats. Dogs were domesticated. Humans selected wolves that were friendlier, more biddable, better at following commands. Over thousands of years of active breeding, we transformed wolves into creatures that look to humans for guidance, that bond with us, that see us as pack leaders. Cats domesticated themselves. Think about what that means. Among the African wildcats living around these early settlements, there would have been natural variation in temperament. Some would have been extremely shy, fleeing at the first sign of humans. These cats probably caught fewer mice because they couldn't hunt near the grain stores without panicking. They produced fewer offspring. Other cats would have been moderately tolerant of humans. They could hunt near settlements but remained wary, keeping their distance. These cats did okay, catching enough prey to survive and reproduce, but not thriving. Then there were a few, just a small percentage, that were naturally less fearful. Not tame exactly, but less reactive to human presence. These cats could hunt right up to the edges of human activity. They could den under buildings where they were protected from larger predators. They could occasionally scavenge scraps from human refuse. They caught more mice, survived better, produced more kittens, and crucially, they passed on their temperament to their offspring. Not through culture or training, but through genetics. Whatever genes made them less fearful of humans, more tolerant of proximity, more capable of thriving in human-modified environments, those genes became more common in each generation. This is what biologists call self-selection. Instead of humans choosing which cats to breed, the environment around human settlements created selection pressure that favoured certain traits. Over hundreds of generations, over thousands of years, cats evolved to live alongside humans without becoming dependent on us in the way dogs had. They remained independent hunters. They kept their solitary territorial behaviours. They didn't develop the pack bonding that makes dogs so eager to please. But they became comfortable enough around humans to occupy the same space, to benefit from the rodent populations we inadvertently cultivated, to accept occasional food offerings without feeling threatened. The archaeological evidence for this process is fascinating. For a long time, researchers thought cats were domesticated much later than other animals, maybe only 4,000 years ago in Egypt. But then they found something extraordinary on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. Cyprus has never been connected to the mainland. Any animals there had to be brought by boat. And at a site called Chilurokambos, excavated in the 1990s, archaeologists discovered something that changed our understanding of cat domestication forever. A burial, 9,500 years old, a human grave containing not just human remains, but the complete skeleton of a cat, carefully placed beside the person. This wasn't a wild cat that happened to die nearby. The burial was intentional, deliberate. The cat had been placed in the grave with the same care as grave goods, personal belongings, the items that mattered to this person in life. And for a cat to be on Cyprus at all, it had to have been transported there by boat from the mainland. You don't accidentally end up with wild cats on your boat. Someone brought that cat intentionally. This tells us that by 9,500 years ago, the relationship between humans and cats was already established, already strong enough that people were bringing cats with them when they colonized new territories, already meaningful enough that a cat might be buried alongside a beloved human. But it also tells us something else. If the relationship was that developed 9,500 years ago, the process must have started much earlier, probably right at the beginning of agriculture, 12,000 years ago or more, which means cats and humans have been living together for as long as we've been farming. They're not just companions, they're partners in the agricultural revolution, co-evolutionary participants in the transformation that made civilization possible. Other sites across the Fertile Crescent have yielded similar evidence, cat bones showing up in early agricultural settlements. Not wild animals hunted for food, but individuals that lived and died within human communities. Kittens buried with care. Adult cats showing skeletal evidence of being well fed, protected from predators, living longer than wild individuals. By 7,000 years ago, cat remains are showing up in settlements across the Mediterranean and into Europe. They're not just Middle Eastern animals anymore. They're spreading along the same routes as agriculture, following humans as we carry farming practices into new territories, and everywhere they go they're providing the same service: rodent control, grain protection, the invisible infrastructure that made food storage possible. Without cats, agriculture might have been impossible, or at least much less successful. Imagine trying to maintain grain stores when rodent populations could multiply unchecked. The losses would have been catastrophic. Entire harvests consumed by mice and rats, starvation, collapse. But with cats, with these perfect little hunting, machines naturally selecting themselves to live alongside us, we could store surplus, we could plan ahead, we could support larger populations, specialized labor, all the complexity that would eventually lead to writing, mathematics, astronomy, everything we call civilization. And the cats asked for almost nothing in return, just the opportunity to hunt, just proximity to prey. They didn't need us to feed them, shelter them, or protect them. They were capable of all that themselves. They simply chose to do it near us because it made evolutionary sense. This is the fundamental difference between cats and every other domestic animal. We chose dogs, we chose sheep and cattle and pigs, but cats chose us. And in doing so, they set in motion a relationship that would last for millennia, that would take both species around the world, that would elevate cats from practical mousers to sacred beings, from working animals to beloved companions. But first, they had to change, because the cats living in those early settlements weren't quite house cats yet. They were still essentially wild animals that had learned to tolerate humans. What happened next? The genetic transformations that would make them truly domestic. That's where the story gets really remarkable. Now here's where the story gets really strange. You'd think that transforming a solitary, fierce predator into an animal willing to live alongside humans would require massive genetic changes. wholesale rewiring of the brain, fundamental alterations to behavior, temperament and physiology. You'd be wrong. When scientists finally sequenced the domestic cat genome in 2007 and started comparing it to wild cats, they found something that shocked them. The genetic difference between your house cat and a Scottish wild cat, a truly wild feline that has never been domesticated, is almost invisible. We're talking about changes in maybe 13 key genes out of roughly 20,000 in the cat genome. That's it. Less than 0.1%. Think about that for a moment. 10,000 years of living with humans, 10,000 years of selection favouring tameness, docility, and tolerance of human presence. And the genetic signature of all that change is so small, you could almost miss it entirely. But here's the thing about evolution. Sometimes the smallest changes make the biggest difference. You don't need to rewrite the entire genetic code to transform an animal. You just need to tweak a few key genes at exactly the right moments in development. Like adjusting a handful of dials on a complex machine and watching the whole system shift into a completely different configuration. So what changed? Where did the genetic revolution happen that turned wildcats into the animals sleeping on your couch? The first cluster of changes happened in genes related to fear response, specifically genes that control how the brain processes novel situations and unfamiliar stimuli. In wild cats, these genes create what biologists call neophobia, fear of new things. It's a crucial survival adaptation. When you're a small predator in a dangerous world, anything new might kill you. That strange smell could be a larger predator. That unusual sound might signal danger. The safest strategy is simple. Avoid everything unfamiliar. But in the early agricultural settlements, cats with slightly reduced neophobia had a massive advantage. They could get closer to human activity, closer to the granaries where rodents congregated, closer to the food waste that accumulated around settlements. A wild cat that fled at the first sight of a human might stay 200 meters away from a village. A cat with just slightly reduced fear might approach to within 50 meters. That difference translated directly into calories, and calories meant survival and reproduction. The genetic changes were subtle, not a complete elimination of fear. That would have been fatal. Just a slight dialing down of the panic response. A small adjustment to how the amygdala, the brain's fear center, processed information about humans. Cats that carried these variants weren't fearless. They were just less terrified. And crucially, this wasn't something humans were deliberately selecting for. Nobody was breeding cats yet. This was pure natural selection. The environment of human settlements automatically favouring cats that could tolerate proximity to people. The second major change happened in genes related to reward-seeking behaviour and food motivation. Wild cats are obligate carnivores, meaning they need to eat meat to survive. But they're also incredibly conservative about their diet. A wild cat typically eats what it learned to hunt as a juvenile and shows little interest in novel foods. This makes perfect sense in the wild. Trying new foods is risky. That strange prey item might be toxic or just not worth the energy to catch. But around human settlements, flexibility about food sources became advantageous. Cats that would eat a wider variety of prey, or even scavenge occasionally from human food waste, had more caloric options. The genetic changes involved neurotransmitter systems, particularly dopamine pathways that control motivation and reward. These modifications made food rewards slightly more salient, made the effort of approaching human areas slightly more worthwhile. Again, subtle changes, not transforming cats into dogs who will eat literally anything, just small adjustments that made them a bit more flexible, a bit more willing to explore new food opportunities. The third cluster of changes, and perhaps the most important, involved genes related to memory and learning, specifically social learning. Wild cats are solitary. They don't learn much from watching other cats. Each individual figures out hunting and survival through trial and error. But in the semi-domestic environment around human settlements, cats that could learn from observing other cats had an advantage. If one cat figured out that a particular granary was safe and full of mice, cats that could learn this by observation didn't have to risk discovering it themselves. If some cats learned that certain humans were tolerant while others were dangerous, cats that could pick up this information socially could navigate the human environment more effectively. The genetic changes enhanced neural plasticity during juvenile development and slightly extended the sensitive period for social learning. This meant young cats growing up around humans could learn to tolerate them more easily, and could learn from their mothers which humans and which situations were safe. But here's what's really fascinating. Unlike dogs, unlike sheep, unlike cattle, unlike virtually every other domesticated animal, cats retained almost all of their wild hunting abilities. A house cat is still a near-perfect predator, the same body plan as a wild cat, the same reflexes, the same hunting instincts, the same ability to survive independently if necessary. This is unprecedented in domestication. When humans domesticated dogs, we got animals that are dramatically different from wolves. Different body proportions, different skull shapes, different behaviours. Sheep are nothing like wild mouflon. Cows look absurd compared to aurochs. But cats are basically just wild cats that aren't terrified of us. Why? The answer lies in how cat domestication happened. With other animals, humans were actively breeding them, selecting for specific traits, making deliberate choices about which animals reproduced. This creates strong directional selection that can dramatically alter body plans and behaviours. But cats domesticated themselves. They chose to live near humans, and the only trait that really mattered was tolerance of human presence. Everything else, all their wild abilities, their hunting skills, their independence, their predatory nature, all of that remained advantageous, even in the semi-domestic environment. A cat that was great at hunting mice was more valuable near a granary. A cat that could survive independently meant it didn't starve when food was scarce. A cat that retained its wild agility and reflexes was better at avoiding danger. Natural selection preserved the wild cat while just tweaking the fear response enough to allow proximity to humans. This created a unique evolutionary situation, an animal that was simultaneously wild and domestic, predator and companion, independent and social. Your cat contains this contradiction in its genes. It's not really fully domesticated in the way dogs are. It's something else entirely. A wild animal that evolved to tolerate us just enough to share our spaces while remaining fundamentally unchanged. But there was one visible change that began appearing in the archaeological record around 5,000 years ago: coat colour variations. The first domestic cats in Egypt were still mostly the same brown-grey tabby pattern as wild cats, but then something happened. Orange cats appeared. Black cats, white patches, eventually the full rainbow of coat colours we see today. This is actually a classic sign of domestication, something biologists call the domestication syndrome. When you reduce selection pressure on camouflage, which happens when animals live in human-protected environments, coat colour genes start to vary wildly. The mutations were always happening, but in the wild, a bright orange cat would be spotted by prey and starve, or be spotted by predators and get killed. In and around human settlements, coat colour didn't matter as much. There's also a genetic connection between the genes controlling tameness and the genes controlling pigmentation. They're linked in ways we're still trying to understand. Animals selected for tameness often spontaneously develop coat colour variations. Russian scientists demonstrated this dramatically with foxes, breeding wild foxes for tameness over just 50 generations, and watching as floppy ears, curled tails and patchy coat colours appeared automatically. Cats went through something similar, though it happened more slowly and naturally. As the genes for reduced fear response spread through populations living near humans, coat colour variations hitchhiked along, spreading even though they provided no survival advantage. And humans? We loved it. The variety made cats more interesting, made individual cats more recognisable. Probably accelerated the process by which cats became not just useful animals but companions. You can't really bond with an identical population of brown tabby cats. But an orange cat, a black cat, a white cat with tabby patches, those are individuals. Those are animals you can name and recognise and form relationships with. By 3,000 years ago, Egyptian art shows cats in multiple colours. Black cats with green eyes, tabbies with white paws. The genetic revolution was visible to everyone, even if nobody understood the mechanisms. But the core of what made cats domestic remained invisible. Those 13 genes, those tiny tweaks to fear and motivation and learning. Changes so subtle you could sequence a cat's genome and almost miss them entirely. Changes that nevertheless transformed humanity's relationship with one of nature's most perfect predators. We didn't create domestic cats through deliberate breeding. We created an environment, and cats evolved to exploit it while remaining essentially wild. That's the genius of cat domestication. It's not really domestication at all. It's evolutionary opportunism. It's a wild species finding a niche and adapting just enough to fill it while changing as little as possible. Every cat alive today carries this evolutionary compromise in its DNA. Wild enough to hunt, tame enough to sleep beside you, independent enough to survive alone, social enough to choose not to. The perfect genetic balance between two worlds, maintained by the smallest possible number of genetic changes. That's what science found when it finally looked inside the cat. Not massive transformation, but elegant minimalism. Not wholesale genetic rewiring, but subtle adjustments to a handful of crucial systems. Evolution at its most efficient, changing everything while changing almost nothing. By 3000 BCE, cats and humans had been living alongside each other for nearly 7,000 years, but their relationship was about to change in ways that would echo through millennia. Something was happening along the Nile that had never happened before. Cats weren't just becoming useful, they were becoming divine. Picture the Nile Valley around 2900 BCE. Egypt was consolidating into a unified kingdom. Agriculture was exploding. Massive granaries were being built to store wheat and barley. And with those granaries came something else, an absolute plague of rats and mice. We're not talking about a few rodents here and there. Archaeological evidence suggests that grain stores in early dynastic Egypt could attract thousands of rodents, creating infestations that threaten the entire food supply. Enter the cats, the same African wildcats that had been hanging around farming villages for millennia. But now they weren't just catching the occasional mouse. They were the only thing standing between Egyptian civilization and starvation. A single cat could kill dozens of rodents in a night. A population of cats protecting a granary complex could save enough grain to feed thousands of people through the dry season. The Egyptians noticed, and they didn't just appreciate their cats, they began to worship them. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Early Egyptian art shows cats as useful animals, depicted hunting birds in marshes alongside humans. But by the time of the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, something had shifted. Cats were appearing in religious contexts, being mummified, being buried with honours previously reserved for humans. The practical had become sacred. At the centre of this transformation was Bastet. Originally depicted as a fierce lioness goddess, Bastet gradually transformed into a more domestic figure, a cat-headed woman who represented protection, fertility, and joy. This transformation mirrors exactly what was happening with actual cats. The wild, dangerous predators were becoming companions, protectors, members of the household. But Bastet wasn't just any goddess. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, she'd become one of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Her cult centre at Bubastis in the Nile Delta became one of the wealthiest and most visited religious sites in ancient Egypt. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, described festivals at Bubastis that attracted over 700,000 pilgrims. That's more people than lived in most ancient cities. These weren't sombre religious gatherings. Herodotus describes music, dancing, wine flowing freely, women singing and shaking rattles. The celebration of Bastet was joyous, ecstatic, a massive party in honour of the cat goddess. This tells us something profound about how Egyptians viewed cats. They weren't just useful or sacred. They were sources of joy, pleasure, life itself. And then there were the mummies, millions of cat mummies. When archaeologists first discovered the cat cemeteries at Bubastis and Saqqara in the late 1800s, they found something staggering. Literally millions of carefully mummified cats, wrapped in linen, sometimes placed in elaborate bronze or wooden coffins, buried in vast underground galleries that stretch for hundreds of meters. Let that sink in. Millions of cats, each one individually prepared for the afterlife using techniques that would have taken hours of skilled labour. Each one representing a significant expense for the family that sponsored the mummification. This wasn't just religion. This was an entire industry built around honouring cats. But here's where it gets complicated. Analysis of these mummies reveals something disturbing. Many of these cats were killed young, specifically for mummification. They were bred in temple catteries, raised for a few months, then killed and mummified to be sold to pilgrims who would donate them to the goddess. It was a religious economy, like buying a candle to light in a church, except the candle was a cat. Modern sensibilities recoil at this, but for the Egyptians it made perfect sense. Offering a cat to Bastet was offering something precious, something that embodied the goddess herself. The cats weren't being harmed in the Egyptian view. They were being elevated, transformed into sacred offerings that would please the goddess and bring blessings to the donor. And Egyptian cats were protected in ways that would seem extreme even by modern standards. Multiple ancient sources confirm that killing a cat, even accidentally, could result in the death penalty. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes witnessing a Roman soldier who accidentally killed a cat being torn apart by an Egyptian mob, despite attempts by Egyptian officials to save him. Rome and Egypt were allies at the time. The diplomatic incident this caused was enormous, but the crowd didn't care. A cat had been killed. Justice had to be served. When a household cat died naturally, the entire family would go into mourning. They shaved their eyebrows as a sign of grief. The cat would be mummified, even if it was just a household pet rather than a temple offering. Families would visit cat cemeteries to check on their departed companions. The grief was real, the mourning genuine, but the Egyptian obsession with cats created a problem. Other civilizations wanted them too. By 1000 BCE, traders from Greece, Phoenicia, and other Mediterranean cultures were seeing what cats could do and were desperate to acquire breeding populations. For their own countries, Egypt responded with an outright ban on cat exportation. It was illegal to take a cat out of Egypt. The penalty was predictably severe. The Egyptian government even funded special agents whose job was to travel to foreign ports and buy back any Egyptian cats they found, repatriating them to the Nile Valley. It was an ancient version of cultural patrimony law, except instead of artifacts, They were protecting living animals. But you can't stop an idea whose time has come. Cats were simply too useful, too desirable, too perfect for human civilization. Despite Egypt's best efforts, cats escaped. Phoenician traders smuggled them. Greek merchants hid them in cargo vessels. Cats themselves, being cats, probably just wandered onto ships and decided to stay. By 500 BCE, cats were spreading across the Mediterranean, each population carrying the legacy of those Egyptian temple cats in their genes. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, the cult of Bastet was reaching its peak. The cat cemeteries were expanding. The temple catteries were breeding thousands of cats. The festivals were growing larger and more elaborate. At Bubastis, the main temple complex covered over 200,000 square meters. That's roughly the size of 28 football fields, all dedicated to the worship of a cat goddess. Archaeological excavations at these sites reveal something beautiful and strange. Votive statues of cats, thousands of them, in bronze, stone and wood. Some are naturalistic, capturing the elegant lines of a cat at rest. Others are stylized, almost geometric. Many show cats with kittens, emphasizing the fertility aspect of Bastet, and many remarkably show cats wearing earrings. Yes, earrings. Well-off Egyptian families would actually pierce their cats' ears and give them gold earrings. The mummies confirm this. Some mummified cats have holes in their ears where jewellery once hung. This wasn't seen as mutilation. It was adornment, marking the cat as a beloved member of a wealthy household, showing that this particular cat was cherished, protected, valued. The practical role cats played in Egyptian society was equally important. Every granary had cats, every ship had cats, protecting grain cargo from rodents during transport along the Nile. Wealthy households had cats to protect food stores and to provide companionship. Temple complexes maintained large cat populations, both as religious symbols and as practical pest control. Paintings from Egyptian tombs show cats living as family members, sitting under chairs during meals, playing with children, wearing collars. These aren't working animals kept outside. These are companions, integrated into household life in ways that would be completely recognizable to any modern cat owner. And the Egyptians were studying their cats. Medical papyri from ancient Egypt include treatments for sick cats, remedies for various ailments, instructions for care. This is veterinary medicine, practiced 3,000 years before the profession would formally exist in Europe. The Egyptians were learning cat behavior, understanding their needs, figuring out how to keep them healthy and happy. But underlying all of this, the worship and the protection and the mummification was something deeper. The Egyptians saw in cats a reflection of divine order. Cats embodied Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of balance, harmony, truth. They were predators, but also protectors. Wild, but also domestic. Independent, but also affectionate. They killed, but also nurtured their young with fierce devotion. This paradox was at the heart of Bastet herself, a goddess who could be both lioness and house cat, both fierce protector and gentle mother, both wild hunter and domestic companion. The Egyptians understood something that modern science is only now confirming. Cats occupy a unique position in the animal kingdom, perfectly balanced between wild and tame, between nature and civilization. By the time Egypt fell to Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, cats had been sacred there for over 2,500 years. The cult of Bastet would continue under Greek and Roman rule for centuries more. But the secret was out. Cats had spread across the known world, and everywhere they went they brought with them the legacy of those Egyptian temples. The genetic heritage of cats bred and revered along the Nile. Today, every domestic cat carries markers that trace back to those Egyptian populations. The cats purring on our couches are direct descendants of the cats that walked through Bastet's temples, that were mummified and mourned, that wore gold earrings and protected Pharaoh's grain stores. The Egyptians didn't just worship cats, they shaped them, selected them, spread them across the world. They transformed cats from useful animals into something more, something sacred, something that would never again be seen as merely wild. And the cats, they went along with it, because cats have always been excellent at convincing humans that worshipping them is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The Egyptians thought they could keep cats to themselves. They passed laws against exporting them, death penalties for smuggling, temple guards watching the ports. But here's the thing about cats. They've never cared much about human laws. And here's the thing about humans. When we want something badly enough, laws become suggestions. Around 500 BCE, cats began appearing in places they had no business being. Greek ports, Phoenician trading posts, Roman warehouses. Nobody kept records of exactly how this happened. Nobody wrote down the moment the first Egyptian cat was smuggled onto a Mediterranean trading vessel. But genetic evidence tells us it happened, and it happened repeatedly. Multiple lineages of Egyptian cats spreading outward, carried by merchants who recognized their value. Because by this time, the Mediterranean world was facing a problem that Egypt had solved centuries earlier. Grain. Civilization runs on grain. You need to store it, transport it, protect it. And everywhere humans stored grain, rodents appeared. Mice, rats, whole armies of them, eating through supplies that represented the difference between survival and starvation for entire cities. The Greeks tried everything. Weasels, which were aggressive and unreliable. Snakes, which people understandably didn't want living in their food storage. Dogs, which were useless against mice and ate more grain than they protected. Nothing worked as well as cats. So when Greek and Phoenician traders saw how Egyptian granaries stayed rodent-free, they started figuring out ways to acquire a few breeding pairs, quietly. Without mentioning it to Egyptian authorities, the cats spread the way good technologies always spread, along trade routes, following the money, going wherever humans valued them enough to feed them. By 300 BCE, cats were established throughout the Greek world, not common yet, still somewhat exotic but present, doing what they did best, hunting. But they were about to get a much bigger opportunity. The Romans were building an empire, and empires need logistics. The Roman military machine ran on supply lines that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, grain shipments crossing the Mediterranean, supply depots in every province, and ships. Thousands of ships, all of them vulnerable to the same problem that had plagued sailors since humans first went to sea. Rats. Ship rats weren't just a nuisance. They were a catastrophe. They ate food stores, chewed through ropes and wood, contaminated water supplies. A rat infestation could doom a voyage. Roman merchants and naval officers needed a solution. They found it in cats. Within a few generations, cats went from rare curiosities to standard equipment on Roman vessels. Ships' cats became so common that archaeologists find cat bones at Roman ports from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. They travelled everywhere the Roman navy went, which meant they went everywhere. Britain, Germania, North Africa, the Middle East. Every time a Roman ship landed, cats went ashore, some temporarily, some permanently, some escaping, some being traded or gifted to local populations who recognized their value. But the Romans had a very different relationship with cats than the Egyptians did. There were no Roman cat temples, no worship, no divine status. Romans were practical about animals. Dogs for hunting and guarding, horses for transport and war, cats for pest control. Nothing mystical about it. Cats were working animals, valued for their function, not their spiritual significance. This practical attitude might have actually helped cats spread. If you're not worshipping them, you're not going to freak out when they leave. Roman records mention cats casually, the way you'd mention any common tool or animal. Pliny the Elder describes their hunting abilities without any supernatural overtones. Plutarch mentions them in passing when discussing Egyptian religion, clearly finding the Egyptian reverence strange. To Romans, cats were just extremely effective mousers that happened to be small enough to keep on ships. The genetic evidence shows this spread clearly. By the 1st century CE, cats had reached the outer edges of the Roman Empire. Archaeological sites in Britain contain cat bones. Roman forts along the Rhine have them. Ports in North Africa show remains of cats identical to Egyptian types. The Romans had accidentally, through pure practicality, accomplished what thousands of years of Egyptian isolation couldn't prevent. They'd globalized the domestic cat. But something else was happening simultaneously, far from Roman control. To the east, along the ancient trade routes that would later be called the Silk Road, cats were making a different kind of journey. The overland route from the Middle East through Persia, Central Asia, and into China was already thousands of years old by the time cats started travelling it. Merchants had been moving goods between east and west for millennia. Silk, spices, precious metals, ideas, religions, technologies. Now they were moving cats too. This spread happened more slowly than the Mediterranean expansion, but it was just as inevitable. Every trading post needed granaries. Every granary needed protection, and once merchants saw how effectively cats controlled rodent populations, cats became cargo. Not as commodities exactly, more as investments. Bring a breeding pair of cats to a new trading post, let them establish themselves, and suddenly your grain storage losses drop dramatically. By the 1st century CE, cats were appearing in Chinese records. Not as common animals yet, but as noteworthy enough to mention. Chinese writers described them as foreign animals, exotic creatures from the western regions, but they recognized immediately what cats were good for. Chinese granaries face the same rodent problems as everyone else's. Cats solved those problems. What's fascinating is how quickly different cultures developed different attitudes toward cats, even though the animals themselves were genetically nearly identical. The Chinese initially seemed ambivalent. Cats were useful, certainly. But Chinese culture already had its own complex animal symbolism. Dogs had been domesticated in China for thousands of years. Various wild cats were native to the region. The domestic cat from the West was just one more predator among many. But over the next few centuries, something shifted. Perhaps it was Buddhist influence spreading from India. Buddhism generally favours non-violence toward animals, and cats, being relatively peaceful and clean, fit well into Buddhist households. Perhaps it was Taoist philosophy, which valued naturalness and spontaneity, qualities cats embodied perfectly. Or perhaps it was simply that cats are extremely good at making themselves loved by humans, given enough time. By the Tang dynasty, around 700 CE, cats were fully integrated into Chinese society. Poems mention them. Paintings depict them. Archaeological evidence shows they were common in cities and rural areas alike. They'd stopped being exotic Western imports and become simply cats, Chinese cats now. Japan received cats even later, probably around the 6th century CE, brought either from China or directly from trading contacts with Southeast Asia. But Japanese culture embraced them enthusiastically. Early Japanese references to cats treat them almost like treasures, rare, valuable animals kept by the wealthy. The imperial court kept cats. Aristocrats wrote poems about them. Artists depicted them in early Japanese paintings with the kind of attention usually reserved for important subjects. This probably tells us something about how cats arrived in Japan. not aboard trading vessels as working animals, but as deliberate imports, gifts between rulers, status symbols, creatures valuable enough to be worth the difficulty of transport. Only later, as cat populations grew, did they become common enough to spread into broader society and take up their usual role as pest controllers. Meanwhile, another group was moving cats in a completely different direction. The Vikings, expanding from Scandinavia starting around 800 CE, brought cats wherever they sailed. And the Vikings sailed everywhere. They reached Iceland, Greenland, possibly even North America. They raided and settled throughout Britain, Ireland and France. They traded as far as Constantinople and Baghdad, and they brought cats on their longships for the same reason Romans had: rats. The genetic signature of Viking-spread cats is distinctive. Analysis of modern Scandinavian cats shows they're descended from multiple founding populations, some from trading contact with the Roman world centuries earlier, some brought later during Viking expansion. The Vikings were apparently systematic about it. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows cat remains across their entire sphere of influence, from Dublin to Kiev. Cats in northern Europe face challenges their Mediterranean ancestors never encountered. Harsh winters, long periods of darkness, different prey animals, different human cultures. But they adapted with the same flexibility they'd shown in Egypt thousands of years earlier. Their fur grew thicker in winter. Their hunting strategies adjusted to local rodents and birds. Their behaviour shifted to match the indoor-focused lifestyle that northern winters demanded. By the year 1000 CE, roughly 1,500 years after cats first left Egypt, they had spread across 3 continents, from Britain to Japan, from Scandinavia to North Africa. Everywhere humans stored grain, sailed ships, or built cities, cats had found their way. They'd adapted to tropical heat and Arctic cold. They'd fit themselves into cultures as diverse as Roman pragmatism, Chinese philosophy, and Viking seafaring tradition. But they were still fundamentally the same animals that had first walked into human settlements in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years earlier. Genetic analysis shows remarkably little variation. Unlike dogs, which humans selectively bred into hundreds of dramatically different forms, cats had diversified mostly through geography, not human intention. A Norwegian forest cat and a Chinese Li Hua might look different, but genetically they're nearly identical, both carrying DNA that traces back to those first Near Eastern wildcats. This tells us something profound about the nature of cat domestication. Humans didn't really domesticate cats the way we domesticated other animals. We didn't selectively breed them for specific traits, didn't engineer them for particular purposes. We just gave them an opportunity, access to rodents, safe places to live, and cats, being clever, flexible, opportunistic survivors, took that opportunity and ran with it, right around the world. But their journey was about to get much more complicated, because while cats were spreading, so were human ideas about good and evil, purity and sin, angels and demons. And some of those ideas had very specific, very dark opinions about small animals with glowing eyes that hunted in darkness. The next chapter of cat history wouldn't be about expansion. It would be about survival. Picture this. It's 1233 CE. You're a cat living in a medieval European town. For thousands of years, your ancestors have lived alongside humans, protected, valued, even worshipped in some places. But something has changed. Something terrible. The church bells ring and people pour into the streets, but they're not celebrating. They're hunting you. What happened? How did cats go from sacred temple guardians to creatures hunted, tortured, and killed by the millions? How did the bond that had survived 9,000 years nearly break apart in just a few centuries? And perhaps most remarkably, How did cats survive at all? The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, insidious, like a slow poison working its way through medieval European culture. For centuries after cats spread across Europe with the Romans, they'd remained valued members of human society. Not worshipped like they were in Egypt, maybe, but respected. Useful. Farmers appreciated them for keeping grain stores free of mice. Sailors brought them on ships for luck and pest control. Monasteries kept cats to protect their precious manuscripts from rodents. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, something dark was spreading across Europe. Not just plague and famine, though those were coming. Something worse. Fear. The medieval Catholic Church was consolidating power, stamping out anything it deemed heretical or pagan. And cats, with their mysterious behaviours, their nocturnal habits, their independent nature, they started looking suspicious. Very suspicious. Think about it from a medieval perspective. Cats can see in the dark when humans can't. They move silently, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Their eyes glow in firelight. They're active at night, when good Christians should be sleeping. Female cats scream during mating in ways that sound disturbingly human. They can't be controlled or trained like dogs. They don't submit to human authority. To a superstitious medieval mind shaped by church teachings about demons and evil spirits, cats started looking less like useful animals and more like servants of darkness. The turning point came in 1233 when Pope Gregory IX issued a papal decree called Vox in Rama. In this document he described a heretical sect that supposedly worshipped the devil in the form of a black cat. The decree claimed that during their midnight rituals, heretics would kiss the hindquarters of a cat, which would then transform into a demon. Was any of this true? Almost certainly not. But truth didn't matter. The Pope had officially connected cats with devil worship, and the consequences were catastrophic. Across Europe, cats became targets. Not just black cats, though they suffered worst, but cats of all colours. They were accused of being witches' familiars, demonic spirits in animal form that helped witches perform evil magic. The logic was circular and deadly. If you owned a cat, you might be a witch. If you were accused of witchcraft, your cat was evidence against you. If a cat showed up at your door, it might be a demon in disguise. The killings were systematic and horrific. Cats were thrown from tall buildings during festivals, burned alive in barrels, drowned in sacks, tortured in public squares. In some towns, killing cats became a form of entertainment. In others, it was seen as a religious duty. The scale of the slaughter is hard to comprehend. We don't have exact numbers. Nobody was counting cat corpses, but estimates suggest millions of cats were killed across Europe over several centuries. In some regions, the feline population was nearly wiped out entirely. And then came the plague. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, and within just a few years it killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's human population. Entire villages disappeared. Cities lost half their inhabitants. It was the worst pandemic in human history. The plague was caused by bacteria carried by fleas that lived on rats. And you know what animals are really good at controlling rat populations? Cats. Now, historians debate how much the persecution of cats actually contributed to the plague spread. The relationship is complex. Rats were already everywhere in medieval cities regardless of cat populations. The plague arrived on ships from Asia, where cats had been present all along. Climate changes and trade patterns played huge roles in the pandemic's spread. But it's hard to escape the cruel irony. Humans had spent decades killing the animals best equipped to control the very rodents that carried plague-bearing fleas. In trying to protect themselves from imaginary demonic cats, they'd made themselves vulnerable to a very real microscopic killer. The plague didn't immediately rehabilitate cats' reputation, though. If anything, the chaos and death of the pandemic years intensified the witch hunts. People desperate for explanations blamed witches and their feline familiars for the disease. More cats died. But here's the remarkable thing. Through all of this, through centuries of systematic persecution, through being hunted, tortured and killed by the millions, cats survived. Not just as a species, but as companions to humans. How? They did what cats have always done. They adapted. They hid. They relied on individuals who still valued them, who were willing to risk social stigma or worse to keep cats in their lives. Because not everyone in medieval Europe hated cats. The persecution was most intense in certain regions, particularly in Germany, France, and parts of Britain. But there were pockets of resistance, places where the ancient bond between humans and cats remained strong. In Islamic regions, cats continued to be valued throughout this period. The Prophet Muhammad was said to have loved cats, and there are numerous stories in Islamic tradition about his kindness to them. One famous tale describes how he cut off the sleeve of his robe rather than disturb a cat sleeping on it. In Muslim households, cats remained welcome, respected, even loved. In parts of Eastern Europe, particularly in Slavic regions, cats retained much of their pre-Christian significance. They were seen as protective household spirits, guardians against evil rather than agents of it. Old pagan traditions held on longer in these areas, and cats benefited from that cultural continuity. Even in Western Europe, not everyone bought into the anti-cat hysteria. Farmers who understood the practical value of cats for pest control often kept them despite social pressure. Port cities, where sailors still relied on ship's cats for long voyages, maintained higher tolerance for feline presence, and some individuals at great personal risk simply refused to give up their cats. These were the people who preserved the bond. The elderly widow who fed strays in secret, the merchant who kept cats in his warehouse and didn't care what the neighbours said, the child who hid a kitten from parents who feared church condemnation, the monk who quietly allowed cats into the monastery granary despite official disapproval. Cats also survived by becoming harder to catch. Urban cat populations became increasingly feral, learning to avoid humans except when scavenging for food. They moved into walls, cellars, abandoned buildings, anywhere they could hide. Rural cats retreated to barns and forests. The boldest, most trusting cats were killed first. The survivors were the careful ones, the suspicious ones. Natural selection was running in reverse, favouring wild cats over tame bonds. This period created an interesting genetic and behavioural shift. Studies of cat DNA suggest that during the medieval period, there was increased admixture between domestic cats and their wild European cousins. Domestic cats breeding with wild cats, producing offspring that were less socialized to humans but better at surviving without human protection. In essence, cats were partially rewilding themselves. Not going fully back to their wild state, that ship had sailed 9,000 years ago, but backing away from the extremes of tameness that made them vulnerable. Yet even as they hid and adapted, cats never fully left human society. They couldn't. After thousands of years of coevolution, both species had become too interdependent. Cats had lost some of their wild hunting efficiency through domestication. They relied on human environments for concentrated prey and shelter, and humans, even medieval humans living in fear and superstition, still needed rodent control. So a strange equilibrium developed. Cats lived on the edges of human society, tolerated in some contexts, persecuted in others. They learned to read human moods and intentions with even greater accuracy than before. The cats that survived were those that could distinguish between the farmer who would leave them scraps and the mob that would kill them. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the worst of the persecution was beginning to ease. The Protestant Reformation fractured Catholic Church authority. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, including Roman and Greek texts that spoke positively of cats. Scientific thinking began to challenge superstitious beliefs, slowly, gradually. The plague years had also left a lesson, even if people didn't fully understand the mechanism. Cities that had maintained cat populations seemed to recover better from subsequent plague outbreaks. Practical necessity began to override superstition. Grain merchants, textile workers, anyone who stored goods vulnerable to rodents, they started quietly keeping cats again. The rehabilitation was gradual and incomplete. Witch hunts continued into the 18th century in some places, and cats remained suspect. But the tide was turning. Slowly, generation by generation, cats were creeping back into human homes and hearts. What's remarkable isn't that cats were persecuted. Humans have shown themselves capable of terrible things toward animals and each other throughout history. What's remarkable is that the bond survived at all, that through centuries of systematic violence, enough humans and enough cats maintained the connection to preserve it for future generations. Those medieval cats hiding in walls, living half wild in abandoned buildings, cautiously approaching the few humans who still offered them food, they were the ancestors of the cats purring on our couches today. They carried forward a relationship that had begun 9,000 years earlier in ancient grain stores through one of the darkest periods in that relationship's history. They survived because that's what cats do: adapt, persist, wait for conditions to improve, and because even in the darkest times there were humans who looked at a cat and saw not a demon, but a companion, who valued that bond enough to maintain it despite the risks. The Dark Ages didn't break the human-cat connection. If anything, it proved how resilient that connection really was. Forged in ancient agricultural settlements, tested by medieval superstition, it endured. Changed, certainly. Scarred, absolutely, but unbroken. And when the age of superstition finally began to fade, when reason and science started displacing fear and dogma, cats were still there, waiting, ready to resume their place in human society. The worst was over. What came next would take cats to every corner of the globe. The oceans came last. For tens of thousands of years, cats had followed us along rivers and roads, through fields and city streets. They had learned our rhythms, mapped our food, memorized our habits. But there was still one part of the world they hadn't truly claimed: the vast, shifting blue that wrapped around the continents like a restless living wall. Then humans built wooden boxes and decided to live inside them, on top of the water. From the perspective of a cat, an age of exploration is a strange thing. Your primates start hammering down trees into long hollow shells. They fill them with food that smells like grain and salted meat and dried fish. The perfect smell if you're a rodent. The perfect disaster if you're a hungry human crossing thousands of miles of open ocean with no way to get more. The ships left port full. They did not stay that way. Rats loved ships. Dark corners, ropes to climb, crates to chew through, holds to hide in. A floating city made entirely of food and nesting material. They could gnaw through leather, wood, soft metal. They could eat anything you brought with you: flour, biscuits, cured pork, even the ropes holding your rigging together. They carried fleas, and the fleas carried plague. A single infested ship could become a drifting disease bomb, sailing slowly from harbour to harbour. Human sailors figured it out quickly. They didn't need a committee or a scientific paper. They just needed to watch what happened when you put one small predator on board. The rats vanished. So the cats went to sea, not all at once, not with a royal decree. Just in the quiet, practical way most of history actually happens. A harbour somewhere in the Mediterranean. A merchant decides to bring along the mouser from his warehouse just in case. Another captain, watching his grain stores disappear, copies the idea. Word spreads. Ports are noisy, but the rumours that matter travel fast. Soon, almost every serious ship had a ship's cat. Picture it. The deck creaking, the sails full and hard with wind, salt stinging your lips, and somewhere in that swaying, groaning, wooden world a small striped or black or mottled cat walks as if the planks are steady earth. Tail held level for balance, ears swivelling to track the tiny sounds beneath the floorboards. She's not there for company, though sailors will pet her, talk to her, whisper worries into her fur on stormy nights. She is there as living pest control. Food on wooden ships was life compressed into crates and barrels. Fewer rats meant fewer chewed rations, fewer spoiled sacks, fewer diseases spreading through cramped sleeping quarters. Captains might argue about charts and routes and politics, but nobody argued with the results of a good mouser. A single cat could mean the difference between arriving hungry and arriving starving, and cats adapted. They learned the sounds of the ship, the rhythm of the waves. They discovered that if you jump wrong, you don't land on another roof or tree branch. You land in cold, endless water. Some fell, many didn't. Natural selection works at sea too. The shipborne lines that survived were the ones that kept their balance, learned not to leap after every seagull, waited for the right moment to pounce on a scurrying shape instead. Over time, something subtle happened. Cats began to map the world, by accident. Every time a new route opened, a cat walked it. Portuguese caravels heading down the coast of Africa, Spanish galleons pushing west into the unknown, Dutch traders navigating icy northern passages, British naval vessels circling the globe. On almost every one, a pair of sharp, watchful eyes glowed in the dark hold, hunting the same prey that had first drawn cats into grain stores thousands of years before. When Europeans reached the Americas, cats were already with them. They slipped down gangplanks in the early morning, whiskers twitching at strange new smells, tropical forests steaming in the heat, dry plains stretching out under alien stars. They did what cats always do in new places, found shelter near humans, watched, waited, hunted. Some stayed in ports, living among warehouses and taverns. Others walked inland along roads and rivers, following carts and caravans. Colonists brought more cats with every ship, because wherever humans tried to store food, rodents followed, and wherever rodents gathered, cats were the simplest answer. So house cats, descendants of Near Eastern wildcats that had first made a truce with farmers among wheat and barley, found themselves padding through New World settlements, hunting North American mice and voles and rats that had never seen such a precise feline predator. They didn't stop there. Ships turned south, rounding the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. East India companies formed, their sails blackened by long voyages, holds filled with spices, silks, teas. Alongside them, as always, sacks of grain, always rats, and always cats. They went to India, padding through dusty warehouses in coastal cities. They went to Southeast Asia, slipping between bamboo houses, learning the patterns of tropical nights. They rode with Dutch and British ships to what they called the East Indies. They waited on decks under strange constellations, watching flying fish leap in the dark. Then, one day in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, humans pointed their ships at land no feline ancestor had ever known. Australia, New Zealand, remote Pacific islands, places that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. Cats, balanced effortlessly among coiled ropes, watched as shorelines that had never heard a purr came into view. From a sailor's perspective, bringing cats ashore made sense. New colonies, new farms, new granaries, barns and storehouses, all vulnerable to rodents. The pattern repeated. Humans move in, rats follow, cats arrive to control them. But evolution doesn't care about human plans. Many of those islands had never seen a medium-sized mammal predator like a cat. The native animals had evolved without anything that stalked silently at night, eyes reflecting starlight, paws muffling every footfall, ground-nesting birds, small marsupials, reptiles that had never had to read the language of a stalking silhouette. To them, cats were something like a new physical law, a hunger that didn't fit any old pattern. On islands from Hawaii to New Zealand, from the Galapagos to Pacific atolls, cats multiplied. Sometimes by accident, a pregnant ship's cat slipping away into the scrub, or kittens set free by well-meaning settlers. Sometimes deliberately released to control pests. They did control pests. They also hunted anything else small and catchable, birds that had never learned to fear land-based hunters. Lizards stunned by sudden, elegant violence. Native rodents that couldn't outthink this imported specialist. Ecologists call cats on islands an invasive species. The data are grim. Extinctions, populations in freefall, fragile ecosystems disrupted by a predator whose original alliance with humans had involved just one simple agreement. You keep the grain safe, we let you stay. On the open ocean, the cat-human pact had been almost perfect. In cat terms, the ship was a rich, self-contained savanna of prey with one rule: don't fall off. On islands, the equation changed. The ships sailed away. The cats stayed. You can almost imagine the confusion the first time. A ship's cat, used to the rolling deck and the daily routines, bells, shouts, ropes, slapping wood, stepping onto stable, silent ground that just doesn't move. No hull creak, no pitch or roll, just grass, sand, unfamiliar plants, night air that smells of flowers and soil instead of tar and salt. The ship sails at dawn. The cat doesn't make it back in time. She's alone now, carrying the genes of Near Eastern wildcats, the behaviours refined in Egyptian granaries, medieval European barns, Renaissance dockyards. All of that history, all that selection for tameness, just enough to live with humans, independence just enough to survive without them, compacted into one small body. She hunts, she survives, she breeds. Her kittens are the founders of a new population. Do this on enough islands, over enough years, and something else begins to happen. You get difference. Cats in cold northern ports needed thick coats, strong bodies, wide paws to navigate ice and snow. Cats in tropical colonies faced different pressures, parasites, heat, dense vegetation. Long-haired cats that stowed away from Persian or Turkish ports suddenly found themselves in cool, damp climates where their fur was an advantage. Short-haired mouses with certain colour patterns might blend better into the scrub of a new land. Then humans, always eager to categorise and collect, began to notice. Certain harbour towns became known for particular types of cats. The long-haired, luxurious animals in northern Europe that would help give rise to breeds like the Norwegian forest cat, and later the Maine Coon in North America. Sleek, fine-boned mouses in Southeast Asia that would eventually be called Siamese and Burmese by Western breeders who discovered what local people had known for centuries. Sometimes the isolation was not an island of land, but an island of culture. A remote lighthouse with one family of keepers and a handful of cats, generation after generation, selecting for friendliness, or hunting skill, or a particular coat. A naval base at the edge of empire where crews adopted litters and took them onward, spreading those traits from port to port. A trading station where one striking tom with an unusual ear shape or tail length passed his genes into every alleyway. The age of exploration turned oceans from barriers into highways. For cats, this meant that the slow, land-bound spread of their ancestors suddenly jumped continents in a single voyage. Populations that had once been limited by walking speed were now sealed into wooden hulls and carried across hemispheres in weeks or months. And everywhere they went, stories followed. Sailors are superstitious. They watch the cats on their ships with an attention that bordered on reverence. A cat that survived a terrible storm might be seen as good luck, a living talisman. A cat that refused to come above deck before a voyage could make hardened men uneasy. Names accumulate around them like barnacles on a hull. There was Trim, the black and white cat who sailed with Matthew Flinders as he circumnavigated Australia in the early 1800s. Trim learned to keep his footing on the heaving deck, fell overboard more than once and managed to climb back via ropes, claws digging in. Flinders adored him, calling him friend in his journals, a quiet companionship against a backdrop of storms and shipwrecks. There were the nameless cats aboard whaling ships, hunting rodents while their human shipmates hunted leviathans. Cats aboard Spanish treasure galleons, cats in the cramped wooden worlds of slave ships pacing between chains and barrels, silent witnesses to some of the darkest voyages humans ever undertook. Later, in the era of iron and steel, the tradition continued. Naval vessels of the 19th and early 20th centuries still kept cats. There was Simon of HMS Amethyst, who survived shellfire during the Yangtze incident in 1949, continued to catch rats in the damaged half-sinking ship, and comforted injured sailors in the infirmary. He was awarded a medal, the Dickin, for animal gallantry, but from his perspective he'd only done what his ancestors had always done: hunt, endure, stay close to the humans who fed him. Multiply these stories by thousands of voyages over hundreds of years. Each ship's cat a small node in a global web of movement. Each pair of paws tracking sawdust and salt from deck to dock, from dock to alley, from alley to farmhouse. Their spread was not a neat wave, but a constant sprinkling, a dusting of felines over every coastline humans touched. By the end of the age of exploration, cats had done something almost no other domesticated animal managed. Without being driven in herds, without being loaded as cargo, without having entire professions built around their transport, they had nonetheless reached almost every corner of the inhabited world. Not as carefully controlled breeding stock, but as working passengers, colleagues, quiet, efficient specialists contracted by necessity. The planet, which had once held pockets where no small feline eyes watched from the shadows, was now ringed by their presence. Ports that had never known the scrape of claws on wood now echoed with it. Islands that had evolved in splendid isolation now heard, for the first time, the low, throaty purr of a creature that had chosen, long ago, to live in our shadow. And above all those new coasts and strange foreign skies, cats did what they always do when the day ends. They found a warm place to curl up, on a bunk beside a sleeping sailor, under a crate in a lantern-lit warehouse, in the corner of a rough settler's hut, where the wind hissed through gaps in the boards and rodents rustled in the dark, tail wrapped around their nose, ears half-tilted, never fully off duty. The world had grown larger for humans, mapped in latitude and longitude, trade winds and sea lanes. For cats it had grown larger too, but in a different way. New kinds of prey, new hiding places, new humans to study and train. They had circled the globe not with maps and compasses, but with patience, claws, and an unspoken agreement made long before any sail ever caught the wind. The world that welcomed the first Victorian cats was noisy, smoky, and made of brick. For thousands of years, cats had been allowed into human spaces mostly on sufferance. They caught mice on ships, guarded granaries, haunted barn lofts and alleyways. Useful, yes, admired sometimes, but still workers, still half wild. Then the 19th century happened. In just a few human lifetimes, huge stretches of Europe and North America were transformed. Fields became factories, villages swelled into cities, railways stitched distant places together with iron threads, gas lamps turned night into a hazy imitation of day. And cats followed us, not because anyone invited them, not at first. They came because cities, like granaries and ships before them, produced what cats had always loved most: rodents, hiding in the walls and scurrying through the sewers. Wherever humans concentrated food and trash, the mice and rats came. Wherever the rodents came, the cats slipped in after them, like shadows in the new urban glow. But something subtle was changing. In a farmhouse, a cat could be just another tool, a living trap that you didn't have to think much about. In a city apartment, a single animal sharing your small, crowded space started to look different. When you spend every evening in the same 2 or 3 rooms, the small warm creature asleep on your chair isn't just a hunter. It becomes part of the landscape of your life. Industrialization didn't just build factories, it built loneliness. People moved away from extended families, from familiar fields and old neighbours, into rooms stacked on top of other rooms, separated by thin walls and thick routines. Cities could be crowded and isolating at the same time, and into that strange, new, emotional environment stepped the cat. Still catching mice, yes, but now also sitting in laps. By the middle of the 1800s, that shift had begun to crystallize into something the world had never quite seen before. The idea of the cat as a proper companion. Not a sacred animal, like in ancient Egypt. Not a tolerated worker, like in the Middle Ages. Something softer, closer, more domestic. A roommate with whiskers. You can see the change most clearly in one very Victorian invention. The cat show. Imagine this. It's 1871, and you're walking into the Crystal Palace in London. This building is already a symbol of the age, a vast greenhouse of iron and glass designed to celebrate industry, progress, and all the marvels the British Empire could gather. But today it's full of cats. Rows of cages are lined up like little golden stages, each containing an animal that, in another century, might have been prowling a barn. Now they have name cards, descriptions, categories. Judges walk by taking notes, spectators leaning close, murmuring to each other about coat, temperament, elegance. This wasn't an accident. It was orchestrated. A man named Harrison Weir, often called the father of the cat fancy, decided that the animal who'd been living in our shadows for millennia deserved a day in the sun. He organised that first Crystal Palace cat show. He drew up classification standards. He wrote about cats as individuals with personalities, histories, and beauty worth noticing. In doing so, he did something quietly revolutionary. He took the cat out of the anonymous swarm of alley and barnyard life and placed it on a pedestal, sometimes literally, as a subject of admiration. The same culture that had created breed standards for dogs, cattle, and horses now turned its measuring gaze on felines. Soon, others joined him. Frances Simpson, a writer and enthusiast, became one of the first great chroniclers of the cat world. Her books and lectures in the late 19th and early 20th centuries helped turn cat fancy from a novelty into a movement. She didn't just describe breeds. She told stories about living with cats, about their quirks and charms, about their right to comfort and care. Clubs formed, the National Cat Club in Britain, the Cat Fanciers Association later in the United States. People who might once have discussed politics or poetry at their parlours now compared Persian coats and tabby markings. Awards were given, lineages were tracked. The language of purebred, pedigree and champion slipped quietly into cat life. From one angle, this looks like mere fashion, Victorian fussiness applied to fur and whiskers. From another, it marks a deeper shift. When we start to plan an animal's ancestry, we're no longer just tolerating its presence, we're imagining its future, deciding what kind of cat should exist. Tall ears or small, long hair or short, calm temperament or fiery independence. The Victorian cat fancy movement turned cats into subjects of deliberate design. But breeding wasn't the only way urban life remade the feline role. The very structure of Victorian cities reshaped the relationship with cats. Urbanisation compressed life into vertical piles. Tenements and townhouses stacked humans above shopkeepers above cellar-level storage. Rodents still thrived, but now the battle against them took place within narrow corridors and cramped rooms. In this tight private world, cats' social skills mattered more. A barn cat that scratched everyone who passed might be tolerated if it kept the grain safe. A city cat shared a bed, a hearth, and sometimes a table. House cats were now expected not only to hunt, but to coexist. People began to talk about good-natured cats, amiable cats, sweet-tempered cats. They praised animals that tolerated children, that learned household routines, that seemed to understand the rhythms of human life. The more time cats spent indoors, the more their success depended not just on claws and teeth, but on charm. Art noticed this first. Before the Victorian era, cats appeared in paintings as symbols of sin, of sensuality, of domesticity. They sat in the corners of Dutch still lifes, slinking under tables, sometimes stealing a fish. Useful props, more metaphor than individual. Then artists began giving them centre stage. Louis Wain, an English illustrator, became fascinated, some would say obsessed, with cats. His images showed them wearing clothes, drinking tea, playing cricket, attending concerts. At first whimsical, later increasingly surreal, his cats reflected a new idea, that these animals had inner lives, that they might experience the world with something like human awareness. Other painters softened the cat's image. Kittens curled beside lace-draped cradles, sleek cats soaked in lamplight on velvet chairs. The animal that had once symbolized witchcraft and darkness now glowed in the warm tones of domestic comfort. Literature followed. Children's stories included cats as companions, not just tricksters or villains. Authors like Beatrix Potter, a little later, would famously anthropomorphize other animals, but the Victorian groundwork was already there. Animals as characters you might love, not just creatures you might fear or exploit. Even serious writers began to describe private lives that included cats. Personal letters mention them. Diaries note their habits. The quiet presence at the edge of the writing desk, the soft weight at the foot of the bed, the gentle interruption of a paw on a book. Then came the lens. Photography arrived in the mid-19th century, catching everything from war to weddings. It also caught cats. At first, studio photographers used them as props, something to occupy a restless child, a symbol of coziness in a family scene. But gradually some people started bringing in cats the way we might today, not as decorations, but as subjects. There are faded Victorian photographs of cats posed on little chairs, surrounded by toys, sitting next to their owners. Long exposures made it difficult to capture their movement, so early cat photos tend to show them unnaturally still, staring solemnly into the lens. Yet even frozen in place, they radiate personality. For the first time in history, ordinary people could fix their cat's image in time, keep it after the animal had grown old and gone. That act of memorializing a specific cat with a specific face quietly reinforced the idea that this individual life mattered. As affection and attention grew, so did something else: responsibility. If a cat is just a worker, you don't worry much about its food beyond whether it can catch enough. If a cat is a companion, that changes. You start to ask different questions. Is it hungry? Is it comfortable? Is it clean? In the early and mid-19th century, most cats still ate scraps. Whatever was left from the table, whatever they could hunt, whatever they could steal. But as urban living reduced access to prey, and as middle-class households became more conscious of hygiene and order, scraps and scavenging started to feel inadequate, or at least inelegant. By the late Victorian era, the foundations of modern pet care were being laid. The very first commercial cat foods emerged in this period, and just after, inspired by the success of canned and prepared dog foods. Entrepreneurs realized there was money to be made in feeding not just working animals, but cherished ones. Simple concoctions of meat, grain, and fat were marketed to urban owners who wanted their pets healthy, but also didn't want to deal with raw offal in a tiny kitchen. Sanitation concerns nudged things along too. As more cats lived entirely indoors, the problem of where the cat goes could no longer be ignored. Early solutions were primitive. Sandboxes, ashes, dirt in trays. But the basic idea had appeared. You create a specific place, inside the home, where the cat is allowed to perform a very natural act. You accommodate its biology to your walls. The true revolution in cat litter, absorbent clay marketed specifically for this purpose, wouldn't arrive until the mid-20th century. But the Victorian mindset made it possible. Once you see an animal as a member of the household, you start redesigning the household around it. Bowls, cushions, collars with engraved name tags, locked cupboards to protect food from clever paws. These details sound trivial, but together they mark a boundary crossing. From outside to inside, from tolerated presence to planned for roommate. By the end of the Victorian era, the cat had completed a journey that had taken thousands of years and a single human century. It was still the hunter from the granary, the mouser from the barn, the stowaway from the ship's hold. Its eyes still glowed in the dark with that ancient wild intensity. Its body still moved with the same silent precision that had once stalked desert rodents under Egyptian stars. But now it also did something new. It sat on embroidered pillows in front of coal fires. It walked across piano keys in drawing rooms. It purred on the laps of clerks, factory workers, and novelists at the end of long, exhausting days. In paintings and photographs, in cat shows and parlour games, in the quiet space between the ticking of clocks and the breathing of sleeping cities, the Victorian cat became something almost unheard of in earlier ages. An equal presence in the private theatre of human life, from worker to companion, from shadow to subject, from anonymous mouser to named family member. And once that transformation began, it was impossible to reverse. The stage was set for everything that would follow: the fully indoor cat, the global pet industry, the internet icons and scientific subjects of the modern age. But all of that still lay ahead. For now, in gaslit rooms beneath the sooty skies of 19th century cities, humans and cats were learning something new together. How to share not just food and shelter, but time. How to build a daily life in which the soft weight of a sleeping cat on your feet was not an accident, but an expectation. The long partnership had taken a new shape, and in the quiet spaces between factory whistles and carriage wheels, the purr of companionship was beginning to drown out the sound of tiny running feet in the walls. By the time we reach the 20th century, that quiet pact between humans and cats has spread to almost every corner of the planet. For thousands of years, cats have moved with us slowly, riding caravans and ships, appearing in temple murals and household shrines. Then, in just a few human lifetimes, something like an evolutionary explosion happens, not in their bones this time, but in their numbers. Picture the world in 1900. Most people still live in rural communities. Cities exist, but they're smaller, smokier, denser. Cats are there, of course, on docks, in alleys, in barns at the city's edge. They're workers mostly. Rat control, grain protection, unofficial, half-tolerated members of the household, still more wild than pet. Now press fast forward. In 1950, there are a little over 2 billion humans on Earth. By the early 2000s, there are more than 6 billion. Cities swell into megacities. Apartment towers pierce the sky where fields used to ripple. Rural families pour into urban centres, and with them comes a problem as old as agriculture. Rodents, waste, food stores concentrated in small spaces. Cats step into this new ecological niche like they've been preparing for it for 10,000 years. In country after country, the same pattern appears in the data. Cat numbers climb. In the United States, estimates of pet cats go from a few tens of millions in the mid-20th century to well over 90 million today, with many more living as strays or ferals. Across Europe, Japan, Latin America, the story repeats. Wherever urbanization rises, feline populations follow, until in some cities there are more registered cats than children. But this isn't just about numbers. Something subtler is happening. For most of their shared history with us, cats have been tolerated guests, useful, sometimes beloved, but always a bit apart. In the 20th century, especially the second half, they start becoming something else entirely. Ideal urban companions. Think about what a city is like from a cat's point of view. Limited space, unpredictable schedules, neighbours stacked above and below instead of spread across a landscape. For many traditional domestic animals, cows, horses, even large dogs, this world is a cage. For cats, it's an opportunity. They're small, they're quiet. They can spend 16 hours a day sleeping on a windowsill and consider it a good life. Unlike dogs, they don't need to be walked several times a day. Unlike many birds or exotic pets, they don't require complex environmental setups. Their litter box fits in a corner. Their hunting instincts adapt seamlessly to toy mice and the occasional unlucky cockroach. Most importantly, cats are one of the few domestic animals whose social behaviour is flexible enough to tolerate high-density living. A village barn might see a dozen cats sharing space. An apartment building can hold 100, scattered across floors, coexisting with minimal conflict. They've been practising for high-density life in granaries and harbours since the Bronze Age. The modern city is just a more vertical version. But it's not only convenience that makes them perfect for modern living, it's their emotional profile. In a world that's increasingly loud, fast and overconnected, cats offer a very specific kind of relationship. They don't overwhelm you with constant demands, they give you space. Yet when they choose to curl up against your leg or press their head into your hand, the contact feels deliberate, earned, like a small, private miracle in a crowded world. For a long time, people assumed this was mostly projection, that cats were aloof, semi-tame predators who had learned a few tricks to manipulate human caretakers. Then science started to catch up with what cat people had been insisting for centuries. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, researchers began turning the tools of modern behavioural science and genetics onto the animal purring on the couch. What they found was complicated and strangely familiar. Take cognition. Early studies suggested that cats were less attuned to humans than dogs. They didn't always come when called in laboratory settings. They ignored commands. They walked away in the middle of experiments. Some scientists concluded they simply weren't as socially intelligent. Then others tried something different. Instead of asking cats to behave like dogs, they designed experiments that fit feline psychology. They let the cats acclimate to the lab longer. They tested them in their own homes. They allowed them to choose participation rather than forcing it. The results shifted. Cats, it turned out, were perfectly capable of following human pointing gestures, just like dogs and toddlers. They could learn their names and distinguish them from other words. In one set of studies, cats showed secure attachment behaviours similar to human infants, using their owners as a safe base, exploring a room, then returning for reassurance. When the human left, many cats became visibly distressed. When the human returned, they relaxed. Emotionally, they weren't indifferent at all. They were selective. Brain imaging and hormonal studies added more pieces. When cats engage in friendly behaviour with their humans, slow blinking, rubbing, purring, their oxytocin levels rise. Oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding hormone, the same chemical that surges in human parents when they interact with their children. Human oxytocin levels rise too when they interact with their cats. The bond is measurable, biochemical, mutual. Genetic research deepened the picture. Comparing the genomes of domestic cats to their wild relatives revealed signatures of selection in areas linked to fear responses, memory, and social behaviour. Just as the genes of ancient wild cats once adapted to agricultural villages, modern cat genes are subtly shifting under the pressures of indoor living, human preference, and veterinary care. At the same time that science is peering into cat brains and DNA, something strange is happening in another realm altogether, the digital one. Around the early 2000s, as the internet spreads into homes and pockets, cats suddenly become inescapable. Grainy videos of clumsy kittens, still images of unimpressed tabbies with overlaid text, live streams of shelter litters. From Tokyo to New York, from Moscow to Sao Paulo, cats begin quietly conquering a new territory, the human attention span. Why cats and not goats or parrots or hamsters? Part of the answer lies in their faces and bodies. Cats are extraordinarily expressive in subtle ways. A flattened ear, a twitching tail tip, a slow blink, a widening of the eyes. Much of this is readable even across cultures, even on a small screen. Their movements are also built for comedy and drama. Sudden leaps, misjudged jumps, improvised recoveries that look like deliberate dances. But there's something else happening beneath the memes. When you watch a video of a cat miscalculating a jump and landing in a box it clearly did not intend to occupy, you're seeing a predator stripped of its mythic distance. This isn't Bastet on a temple wall or a sleek hunter in the grass. This is an animal making mistakes, looking embarrassed, regrouping. It's endearing because it's familiar. It mirrors our own daily missteps, reframed in fur and whiskers. Internet cat culture becomes a shared language. A person alone in a tiny apartment in Seoul can laugh at the same ridiculous feline antics as someone in a farmhouse in Canada. Cat images become units of emotional exchange. Comfort, humour, a small soft distraction from stress. In a way, it's just a continuation of the role cats have always played, smoothing the edges of human life. Only now the village is global, and the granary is a cloud server. At the same time, the internet begins to reshape the cats themselves. Online communities coordinate rescue efforts, fund surgeries, support trap-neuter return programs for feral colonies. Viral fame saves individual cats from shelters and inspires people to adopt special needs animals that might once have been quietly euthanized. Awareness spreads about indoor enrichment, proper diets, and the importance of spaying and neutering. Of course, there are shadows too, overbreeding for extreme looks, declawing. The stress of constant handling for animals pushed into influencer roles. Our fascination with cats is a double-edged sword, capable of kindness and harm, which brings us to the present moment. The cat beside you, curled on your pillow, draped over your laptop, or perhaps watching you from the foot of the bed with half-closed eyes, is the product of all of this. A 10,000-year negotiation between independence and intimacy, utility and affection. On one level, the relationship has never been closer. Indoor cats may spend nearly every moment within a few meters of their humans. Veterinary medicine can extend their lives well beyond what their wild ancestors could expect. We talk to them. We interpret their body language. Some of us celebrate their birthdays, buy them furniture, leave our heating on for them when we go out. On another level, the old wildness remains. Under the soft fur and the purr that vibrates against your hand is a brain that still maps the world like a solitary hunter. Many indoor cats live in a state that's biologically unprecedented. High density, low territory, no need to hunt, constant social proximity. We're still figuring out what that means for them and for us. So what comes next? As cities grow even larger and our lives become more digital, cats may become even more common companions. Robotics and AI might someday produce synthetic pets that never shed, never scratch, never wake you at dawn for food. But there's something about the cat's otherness, their refusal to fully bend to our will, that humans seem to cherish. A robot can imitate a purr. It can simulate a slow blink. But it can't decide on its own that tonight it will ignore you completely and stare into the dark, ears twitching at sounds you can't hear. Future research will almost certainly uncover more about their minds. We may learn how they experience time, how they remember us, how they construct their sense of home. Genetic tools might allow us to breed for temperament more precisely, to reduce fear and stress without erasing that essential feline spark. Conservation efforts may try to balance our love of cats with the damage that free-roaming populations can do to native wildlife. Perhaps someday, historians and biologists will look back at this era, the age of indoor cats and internet fame, the way we look back at ancient Egypt or the first granaries in the Fertile Crescent, as a turning point, a moment when the human-cat alliance shifted into a new phase. For now, though, the story has circled back to where we began. A quiet room. A human, somewhere in the long chain of descendants from the first farmers and the first wild cats. A small predator, descended from desert hunters who once slipped between grain sacks under a Levantine moon. Outside, the world hums with cars and servers and satellites. Inside, a cat stretches, blinks slowly, and settles a little closer, as if to say, the bargain still holds. 10,000 years ago, its ancestors chose to linger at the edge of human firelight, trading a little freedom for a little safety, a little closeness. We, in turn, chose to let them stay, to share our food, our homes, eventually our beds, and our screens and our hearts. The mystery purring beside you is the answer to a question your species has been asking since the first seed was planted and the first rodent crept into a storehouse. Who will live with us in this strange new world we are building? The cat's presence is our answer. This is who. So now, when you look at the cat beside you, you're not just seeing a pet. You're seeing the end point of a journey that started in dry grasslands under unfamiliar stars. A small solitary hunter, perfectly tuned for stalking birds and rodents in the dusk, slowly stepped across an invisible line. From wildcat to camp follower, to guardian of grain, to sacred being, to sailor, to city dweller, to the creature currently cleaning its paws at the edge of your bed. It wasn't one moment. It was thousands of years of almost choices. Wildcats choosing to linger a little closer to human fires. Farmers choosing not to drive them away. Priests choosing to carve them into temple walls. Sailors choosing to bring them on ships. Families choosing to let them sleep on the hearth instead of outside. A chain of tiny decisions, small preferences, quiet tolerances, all adding up to the strange fact that there are now more house cats than lions, tigers, leopards and cheetahs combined. And yet, even after all this time, cats are different from almost every other domesticated animal. Dogs bent themselves around us. They watch our faces, read our gestures, live inside the emotional gravity well of human attention. Horses were reshaped to carry us, to pull us, to work in step with our needs. Cows, sheep, goats, chickens, their lives are almost entirely written by human hands. Cats took another path. They never completely surrendered the wild. Their bodies are still built for solo hunting, not team effort. Their brains are still wired to treat the world as a territory divided into safe places, watchful places and hunting grounds. They still insist on streaks of independence that no training can fully erase. They didn't become what we wanted. We slowly became what they would tolerate. And somehow, that's what makes the bond feel so special. You don't command a cat. You negotiate with it. You share a home with a tiny opinionated predator that has agreed, for reasons of its own, to curl up on your lap and vibrate with contentment. That purr is the sound of a truce written across millennia. Farmers and pharaohs, Roman merchants and Chinese scholars, medieval peasants and Victorian collectors, polar explorers and space-age apartment dwellers. All of them, at some point, lay down in the dark with a cat nearby, listening to that same low, steady rumble, feeling that same warmth pressed against their side, knowing, in some deep, pre-verbal way, that the world outside might be dangerous, but for this moment, in this little circle of shared breath and quiet sound, things were safe. If there's a cat with you now, maybe it's watching you from the doorway with half-closed eyes. Maybe it's already asleep, paws twitching through some remembered chase in a dream. Maybe it's settled on your chest, making it just slightly harder to breathe, as cats have been doing to humans since the first straw-lined huts went up beside the first grain fields. You're part of that story. You, in whatever city or small town or countryside you're listening from tonight, are another point in the long network that stretches from ancient barns to modern bedrooms, another human who has been quietly chosen by a small, whiskered descendant of the African wildcat. As you drift towards sleep, you can imagine those first farmers, hearing a faint rustle in the dark and seeing two eyes glowing at the edge of the lamplight. They didn't know they were at the beginning of one of the most successful partnerships in history. You and your cat don't need to know how it ends. You're just living your little piece of it, sharing a bed, a room, a life. Thank you for walking through that history tonight, for following the trail of paw prints from the wild to wherever you are now. Your time and attention mean more to this channel than you can imagine, and it's an honor to help you unwind and drift off. If you'd like to support more stories like this, you can gently tap like, leave a comment and subscribe. If you feel awake enough, you might even tell us where you're listening from and whether there's a cat sharing the night with you. It helps more than you'd think, and it also helps this little community find each other across the dark. And if you ever want to go one step further, there is an optional YouTube membership for the channel. It's there for those who wish to support these videos a bit more, but it is completely optional. Just you being here, listening, is already enough. For now, you don't have to do anything. The story can fade, the room can soften, the cat, if there is one, can curl a little closer, and you can let the long shared history of humans and cats carry you gently into sleep.